my channel. Today we're going to discuss a very dear book to me, For a New Liberty, The Libertarian Manifesto by Murray Rothbard. I'm trying not to say Murray Bookchin, because that's another author that I find super interesting, but on that another day. So today Murray Rothbard, some interesting paragraphs I found. I try to be really quick. I have a lot of material here. I'm trying to make this video 15 minutes, so I might edit it heavily afterwards. So let's get started. The rapid growth of the libertarian movement and the Libertarian Party in the 1970s is firmly rooted in what Bernard Bailyn called this powerful permanent legacy of the American Revolution. But if this legacy is so vital to the American tradition, what went wrong? Why the need now for a new libertarian movement to arise to reclaim the American dream? Another one. American liberalism for at least one long generation has lived off a collection of ideas put together before the World War I. The wellspring for one set of its ideas is Louis Brandeis, for the other Herbert Croly. Since this man wrote, little new has been added to the American liberal ideology. The Croly liberals stresses the role of government in regulating big organizations and strengthening small men. The Brandeis liberal gears his hopes to the magical role of the small businessman. Another one. Classical liberalism constituted a profound threat to the political and economic interests of the ruling classes, who benefited from the old order: the kings, the nobles, the landed aristocrats, the privileged merchants, the military machines, the state bureaucracies. Despite three major violent revolutions precipitated by the liberals, the English of the 17th century and the American and the French of the 18th century, victories in Europe were only partial. Resistance was stiff and managed to successfully maintain landed monopolies, religious establishments, and warlike foreign and military policies, and for a time to keep the suffrage restricted to the wealthy elite. The liberals had to concentrate on widening the suffrage because it was clear to both sides that the objective economic and political interests of the mass of the public lay in individual liberty. Another one. It is interesting to note that by the early 19th century, the laissez-faire forces were known as liberals and radicals, and the opposition that wished to preserve or go back to the old order was broadly known as conservatives. By the middle and certainly by the end of the 19th century, the conservatives began to realize that their cause was inevitably doomed if they persisted in clinging to the call for outright repeal of the Industrial Revolution and of its enormous rise in living standards of the mass of the public, and also if they persisted in opposing the widening of the suffrage, thereby frankly setting themselves in opposition to the interests of that public. Hence, the right wing decided to shift their gears and to update their status creed by jettisoning outright opposition to industrialism and democratic suffrage. For the old conservatives, frank hatred and contempt for the mass of the public, the new conservatives substituted duplicity and demagogy. The new conservatives wooed the masses with the following line: "We too favor industrialism and a higher standard of living, but to accomplish such end, we must regulate the industry for the public good. We must substitute organized cooperation for the dog-eat-dog of the free and competitive marketplace. And above all, we must substitute for the nation-destroying liberal tenets of peace and free trading, the nation-glorifying measures of war, protectionism, empire, and military prowess. For all these changes, of course, big government rather than minimal government was required. And so, in the late 19th century, statism and big government returned, and this time displaying a pro-industrial and general welfare face. The old order returned, but this time the beneficiaries was shuffled a bit. They were not so much the nobility, the feudal lords, the army, the bureaucracy, the privileged merchants, as they were the army, the bureaucracy, the weakened feudal landlords, and especially the privileged manufacturers. Led by Bismarck in Prussia, the new right fashioned a right-wing collectivism based on war, militarism, protectionism, and the compulsory cartelization of business and industry, a giant network of controls, regulations, subsidies, and privileges, which formed a great partnership of big government with certain favored elements in big business and industry. Something had to be done too about the new phenomenon of massive number of industrial wage workers, the proletariat. During the 18th century and early 19th century, indeed until the late 19th century, the mass of workers favored less fair and the free competitive market as best for their wages and working conditions as workers, and for a cheap and widening range of consumer goods as consumers. Even the early trade unions, for example in Great Britain, were staunch believers in less fair. New conservatives, spearheaded by Bismarck in Germany and Disraeli in Britain, weakened the libertarian will of the workers by shedding crocodile tears about condition of industrial labor force, cartelizing and regulating industry, not accidentally hobbling official competition. Finally, in the early 20th century, the new conservative corporate state, then and now the dominant political system in the Western world, incorporated responsible and corporatist trade unions as junior partners to big government and favored big businesses in the new statist and corporatist decision making. To establish this new system, to create a new order which was a modernized, dressed-up version of the ancient regime before the American and French revolutions, the new ruling elites had to perform a gigantic con job on the deluded public, a con job that continues to this day. Whereas the existence of every government, from absolute monarchy to military dictatorship, rests on the consent of the majority of the public. A democratic government must engineer such consent on a more immediate day-by-day basis. And to do so, the new conservative ruling elites had to guard the public in many crucial and fundamental ways. For the masses now had to be convinced that tyranny was better than liberty, that a cartelized and privileged industrial feudalism was better for the consumers than a freely competitive market, that a cartelized monopoly was to be imposed in the name of anti-monopoly, that war and military aggrandizement for the benefit of the ruling elites was really in the interest of the conscripted, taxed, and often slaughtered public. How was this to be done? In all societies, public opinion is determined by the intellectual classes, the opinion molders of society. For most people, neither originate nor disseminate ideas and concepts. On the contrary, they tend to adopt these ideas promulgated by the professional intellectual classes, the professional dealers in ideas. Now, throughout history, as we shall see further below, despots and ruling elites of states have done far more need of the service of intellectuals than have peaceful citizens in a free society. To establish their new statist order, their neo-mercantilist corporate state, the new conservatives therefore had to forge a new alliance between intellectual and the state. In an increasingly secular age, this meant with secular intellectuals rather than with divines, specifically with the new breed of professors, PhDs, historians, teachers, and technocratic economists, social workers, sociologists, physicians, and engineers. This reforged alliance came in two parts. In the early 19th century, the conservatives, conceding reason to their liberal enemies, relied heavily on the alleged virtues of irrationality, romanticism, tradition, theocracy. By stressing the virtue of tradition and of irrational symbols, the conservatives could gull the public into continuing privileged hierarchical rule and to continue to worship the nation-state and its war-making machine. In the later part of the 19th century, the new conservatism adopted the trappings of reason and of science. Now it was science that allegedly required rule of the economy and of society by technocratic experts. In exchange for spreading this message to the public, the new breed of intellectuals was rewarded with jobs and prestige as apologists for the new order and as planners and regulators of the newly cartelized economy and society. One of the ways that the new statist intellectuals did their work was to change the meanings of old labels and therefore to manipulate in the minds of the public the emotional connotations attached to such labels. For example, the laissez-faire libertarians had long been known as liberals, and the purest and most militant of them as radicals. They also been known as progressive because they were the ones in tune with industrial progress, the spread of liberty, and the rise in living standards of consumers. The new breed of statist academics and intellectuals appropriated to themselves the words liberal and progressive and successfully managed to tar their laissez-faire opponents with the charge of being old-fashioned, Neanderthal, and reactionary. Even the name conservative was pinned on the classic liberals. And as we have seen, the new statists were able to appropriate the concept of reason as well. If the laissez-faire liberals were confused by the new recrudescence of statism and mercantilism as progressive corporate statism, another reason for the decay of classical liberalism by the end of the 19th century was the growth of a peculiar new movement, socialism. Socialism began in 1830s and expanded greatly after the 1880s. The peculiar thing about socialism was that it was a confused hybrid movement influenced by both the great pre-existing polar ideologies, liberalism and conservatism. From the classical liberals, the socialists took a frank acceptance of industrialism and the Industrial Revolution, an early glorification of science and reason, and at least a rhetorical devotion to such classical liberal ideals as peace, individual freedom, and a rising standard of living. Indeed, the socialists, long before the much later corporatists, pioneered in a co-opting of science, reason, and industrialism. And the socialists not only adopted the classical liberal adherence to democracy, but topped it with calling for an expanded democracy in which the people would run the economy and each other.